All right, so the debate's a little bit difficult to end up judging because both teams are, I think, it's a little bit the ship passing the night type situation, and like you do a lot of the analysis on the critique page, and then you don't really get to the terrorism page with much time. You all make this, the exact opposite. You spend a lot of time on the case debate page, we don't get to the critique with a lot of time, which means that there's not a lot of interaction that's going on. It's like, reality is created by discourse. Discourse doesn't create reality. There's something that's material beyond that. And so it's like there's a lot of things going back and forth. The only parts where there's real clash, where there's clash between this sort of analysis is taking place is sometimes is like in relationship to the evidence that you're utilizing versus like their philosophy professors and stuff like that. So you're doing some sort of like citation comparisons, which you're not necessarily like pulling out the warrants and doing the clashing with the warrants, which is the next level. But at least you're doing something there. And I think that if you spend more time with on the flow where they're giving the analysis, it's going to be easier for both of you to actually do the individual clash that's necessary. So those things being said, I end up voting affirmative in this round, and I think it's not because you're not winning your link stories. I think that the part that I'm missing from this debate is what do you do, right? You just say your alternative is to vote negative, so I'm not necessarily, but there's not like a lot of contextualization of that negative, like what voting negative is, and I think it's more on the question of like negativity and that pessimism and like how we have to be, how that negativity operates, I think would be desirable. And I think that the 1AR makes a mistake by not getting to the critique flow with a lot of time, because you have a decent amount, you have a pretty good press on negativity in the 2AC, in cross-examination after the 2NC and stuff like that. So I think you have a big press there, but then the 1AR doesn't really go for any of the, the most compelling pieces of offense that exist in this debate. That would make it a lot easier for me to vote affirmative, because you're spending more time just sort of explaining to me how you solve the ISIS threat. And right, they're not contesting your 3 internal links to how you solve it. So you could talk to me about that in every individual speech, and it's not going to change, because I already understand that if I'm getting to the world of being able to evaluate consequences, I'm getting to the world of believe that terrorists are actually threats, you're going to win that you're going to be able to solve or do something in that regard. So you have to spend more time dealing with if they're actually threats, and more time dealing with, press against their offense, opposed to just sort of a description of the case. And that's also my criticism of the 2AR, is that you spend more time, explaining to me how you're solving for these threats, opposed to convincing me that these threats are real and convincing me of those of that analysis. And so, without an articulation of the alternative, I think that it allows me to get some sort of leeway for for the permutation, though not fully the permutation. But I think that some of the analysis the 1NR makes should against the permutation should get into the 2NR that's useful, in terms of the universalizing disadvantage that's created, in terms of homogenization disset. Those sort of arguments make reasons for why, even if they're a step in the right direction, that step in the right direction creates a total whole that then tries to create a coherent picture of a stable subject that you would then be indicting. And so, essentially, I think that the affirmative is a step in the right direction by pulling us away. I think that you need to do more work on sort of establishing how that pullback creates the impacts that you are then able to somehow solve for with the alternative, or be able to resolve these sort of issues. Because I think that they're doing a decent amount of defense on both the discourse debate, but then also sort of a decent amount in terms of reading evidence indicates that the state can make things better for queer people, which is a piece of evidence that was read in the 1AR as well. And so I think that you're just the queers never get access to the state. Not going to be able to do that. Needs more analysis and warrants. I also agree with them that you need more warrants in terms of how queers are able to get access to the state. You both assert that the other side doesn't have warrants. I sort of agree with both of your assertions on this regard, that neither side has warrants within these issues. And I think that given that, in order to get my ballot is really just a little bit about how you're able to solve more than your link analysis, because I think that you're ahead on your links. You're clearly going to win links to this affirmative, even if they might be a step in the right direction. It's just going to be a question of, is that step in the right direction enough to resolve all of those links? Their characterization of the way the criticism goes down is that voting negative doesn't necessarily, it becomes sort of like a drop in the bucket. It's so there's still some links that exist. Who cares? Why can't we just sort of reject these sort of problematic elements and still do the affirmative with in terms of moving forward and that being desirable? And I think that becomes something that's useful. I also think that they're doing a pretty good job of sort of explaining how and this is the easiest argument for me to see how they're a step in the right direction and why there needs to be an alternative that resolves these things better, is the question of like how they are using a constructivist lens opposed to a realist lens. Now, I don't necessarily believe that that is true per se, but I think that that's something that they're continuously pushing, that they're using critical terrorist studies that are being self-reflexive, are not just saying terrorists at large are bad, but that we have to change the way that we do it, and that they're paying attention to these sort of blowbacks. So I think that they are better than the 9/11 forms of responses that existed to terrorism, but I still think that they're creating the links that you're criticizing, which is why the argument that our alternative solves better than the affirmative is sort of is what I need, because if they are like in the direction but you don't necessarily move us in the positive direction, I'm not necessarily sure why those impacts would outweigh, you know, moving positively, I guess is where it's coming from. And so I think that one of the things that could be, one of the ways that you could articulate it, because to me, if you're not going to have an alternative, which is fine for me, you need to win that they're going to make the situation uniquely worse, right? Which is going to require more analysis on the impact level than the link level of the debate. And so what I would have done in order to be able to do that is at the top, when you're talking about like how the Campbell evidence creates a self-other dichotomy that, you know, will inevitably result in the same sort of problems, right? Essentially, you default into almost like a deterrence case that the war systems will be inevitable, but creating an external impact opposed to just a deterrence case impact, right? So that way there's internal and external going on, because if you only have internal, it's like, well, if there's risk of them solving at all in any sense of the imagination, why not end up voting affirmative? And so if you have an external impact, that would be useful. And so impacting out sort of how that self-other then takes place. And I would also point out this, like, you know, even if, like, let's just say, even if they're the right that ISIS is a threat and that they are able to engage with ISIS, then if you take that, you know, Campbell's self-other foreign policy that perpetuates the endless system of war that you know, make reference to, then give other examples of where that would play out. Like after we deal with ISIS, then we'll say, well, now there's Al-Qaeda, and now there's this, you know, Hezbollah, and now there's this other terrorist group, and these all are not necessarily threats, and so that creates sort of a spillover situation. And I think you do. I think you mentioned Vietnam at one point as a way of sort of like paving over it. I think it's out of the Mueller evidence extension where you talk about that. That's the type of stuff that sells your links, but now make it predictive in terms of like other scenarios where we'd be able to fill in and do those same sort of things there. And then I can have an external impact to be like, okay, you make the situation uniquely worse, opposed to your discourse isn't necessarily perfect in that regards. So I also agree that the role of the ballot is new in the 2NR. I think that would be very helpful to have earlier in the debate, because with that, if I gave you the role of the ballot, I would probably end up voting negative, because I think you meet that role of the ballot better than they do given your links. Without that role of the ballot until the last portion of the debate, it becomes difficult for me to figure out how to contextualize your advocacy outside of just say, do they make something worse, or do they, you know, or could they potentially make it better? So having the role of the ballot earlier would be useful, because then that also, you know, makes it clear for how you would want me to frame that ballot, whereas they're doing more of the, you know, throughout the earlier portions of the debate, that sort of framing situation. And so I think that instead of just being responsive to framing, creating a counter framing, right? And so it's like when they don't extend their framework into the 1AR, that would be where I would go to them, pull out, you know, your counter interpretation allows for that role of the ballot, so that way it's not necessarily a new argument opposed to just sort of throwing it out there on the overview at the top. Because when they concede that, I think that makes it a very easy way for me to be able to, you know, you utilize that counter interpretation as a way to be able to frame that ballot, and then it doesn't appear new to me, and then I don't have to be like, well, do they make things a little bit better or not, because then that's not how I approach the round in order to be able to create my ballot. And yeah, so those are the major issues for why I end up voting. I think that the affirmative could definitely make my job easier in the world where you are going for, again, what I said, the offense that exists in the 2AC that is not gotten to in the 1AR, and I think that that's where it's much easier for you to win the debate and then focus on those elements of it, because I think that all the offense that you go for in the 1AR, like including like if there's a successful terrorist attack, things will get worse, is all assuming a world where, you know, where I'm evaluating these consequences. And so in the world where I don't think the role of the ballot is new, then you're way behind on the game. And there are ways where, you know, as I told them, is that if she connects that with the counter interpretation that's not debated about it in the 1AR, where I could then see that as not being potentially a new argument, and then all of your analysis in order to be able to get access to those things are not going to be able to matter because you assume that the terror strike's actually going to be able to take place. And I think that what is useful, what would be useful for me from the negative perspective is, again, like framing that, the debate space in terms of what we exist within, in terms of like, well, we're not going to stop a terrorist attack, right, regardless of how I'm going to vote. So if these things are inevitable and are going to happen within the next couple of months, they're inevitable and going to happen within the next couple of months, which means we should talk about how are we talking about these things and not something else. And I don't think their discourse doesn't shape reality or critical terrorist reflections or stuff like that necessarily gain access in the world of what we're talking about in terms of the debate space. Is there questions?
Yeah, so in the Lochner framework, counter-interpretation is like, look, you just got to do the factor method, but you get to weigh the F. So it kind of makes sense for the 1AR to not feel like they need to extend framework in that debate, just because you've already said, okay, you get to weigh the F.
Right, I would maybe at least clearly point that out in the 1AR. They say we get to weigh the implications of the affirmative, but I would still say when they say you got to defend your method, and they attack your method, that does call questions on if the effect of the plan is how you get to weigh it versus like the method that you utilize.
Okay.
Right, like, so I don't know, like, when you say they get to weigh the plan, do you give them fiat and that they solve for things when you make that argument?
It's that we're not mooting it. The interpretation is that they can still talk about it, they just also have to, like, we get to talk about their methodology.
Yeah, and so that's how I hear it. So I don't think it necessarily spots you fiat, but it spots you the ability to weigh your, critical terror studies discourse in the way that you engage with it. You get to weigh your method, but not necessarily the implication of the plan being passed. Right? So I think it's slightly different than that. In the same way that you're like, alt is unconditional, when that's not clearly sort of what he said. I think that you hear what you want to hear when they're answering these questions, because he said, we'll always defend your bad, which is not always defending the alternative that initially exists. Right, and so it's like it's shady, right? It's that they're not deliberately defending that sort of stuff.
So it's just a roundabout way of saying negation theory.
Yeah, it's like we'll defend that you're bad. All their arguments are relatively consistent, so I guess it's it's also sort of unconditional, but they don't have to go for whatever that initial alternative is per se. Though I think it would be useful to have a specific alternative coming into the later portion of the debate. Other questions? No?
Thank you very much for that.
Right. Thanks for debating.